The heavy oak doors of the Rossi estate in Lake Forest were supposed to be locked, bolted, and alarmed. Gabriel Rossi, the undisputed head of the Chicago syndicate, returned 3 days early from a sun-drenched, blood-soaked trip to Miami, expecting the suffocating, cold silence of his massive home. He expected his 3 daughters to be locked in their rooms, entirely alienated from the monster he had become. Instead, he found the security system disabled, and the foyer plunged into darkness. Drawing his weapon, he moved silently through the hallways he owned, prepared to execute whoever had breached his fortress. But what he found in the flickering light of the sunroom wasn't a hit squad. It was a scene that instantly shattered his ruthless empire and brought the most dangerous man in the Midwest to his knees. The rain in Chicago that night was unrelenting, beating against the tinted bulletproof glass of the Mercedes G-Wagon in heavy rhythmic sheets. Gabriel Rossi sat in the back seat, the leather interior smelling faintly of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of adrenaline that never quite washed off him. At 42, Gabriel had the sharp, unforgiving features of a man who had clawed his way to the top of the city's underground hierarchy. His tailored charcoal suit hid the scars of his 20s, but his eyes, dark, calculating, and perpetually exhausted, told the story of a man who trusted absolutely no one. He wasn't supposed to be back in Illinois until Friday. The meeting in Miami with the Reyes cartel had been scheduled to last a week, a tense negotiation over shipping lanes and offshore accounts. But Gabriel had ended the talks abruptly. A visceral, unexplainable knot in his gut had kept him awake in his penthouse suite overlooking South Beach. It wasn't the feds, and it wasn't the rival families. He had those handled. It was a creeping, insidious paranoia about his own home. His driver, a stoic, broad-shouldered man named Paulie, kept his eyes on the wet asphalt of Interstate 94. "Take the back entrance through the service road, Paulie," Gabriel commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that brokered no argument. "Cut the headlights when we hit the perimeter." "You expecting trouble at the house, boss?" Paulie asked, his thick hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I don't know what I'm expecting," Gabriel replied, staring out at the blurred lights of the passing suburbs. Gabriel's mind drifted to the estate, a sprawling 12,000-square-foot fortress masked as a piece of architectural luxury. Inside that fortress lived the only 3 things in the world he had left to care about, even if he didn't know how to show it: his daughters. Isabella, 17 and fiercely rebellious; Chloe, 14 and devastatingly quiet; and Lily, just 8 years old, with eyes that looked too much like her late mother's. Since his wife Sarah died of a sudden aneurysm 3 years ago, the house had turned into a mausoleum. Gabriel had buried his grief in the syndicate, expanding his territory with a brutal efficiency that left bodies in the Chicago River and his daughters entirely isolated. He provided everything: black cards, private schools, imported cars, but he provided no warmth. To keep them safe, he had surrounded them with guards, high-tech security, and an ironclad set of rules enforced by his second-in-command, Lorenzo. And then there was Nora. Nora Hayes was the maid Gabriel had hired 6 months ago through a high-end civilian agency. She wasn't connected to the life. She was 26, a former nursing student from a working-class neighborhood in Peoria who needed the money to pay off medical debt. She was quiet, kept her head down, and made the girls their meals. Gabriel barely noticed her, which, in his world, was the highest compliment an employee could receive. The G-Wagon slowed, turning onto the gravel service road that wound through the dense oak trees behind the estate. The rain masked the crunch of the tires. Gabriel checked his phone. No messages from Lorenzo, who was supposed to be managing the estate's security in his absence. "Wait here," Gabriel said, popping the door open before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. "Boss, you want me to come up?" Paulie asked, reaching for his own piece. "No. Keep the engine running." Gabriel stepped into the freezing downpour, the chill biting through his wool suit. He bypassed the main driveway, slipping through the manicured hedges with the silent grace of a predator. As he approached the back terrace, his instincts flared. The motion sensor lights attached to the stone facade were entirely dead. He reached the heavy reinforced glass doors of the kitchen. He keyed his code into the biometric lock. The keypad flashed red. Error. Gabriel's blood ran cold. He tried again. Error. Someone had wiped the system. The knot in his stomach tightened into a vice. With practiced fluidity, he drew his suppressed Sig Sauer P-226 from his shoulder holster. If this was a hit by the Russian Bratva or a raid by the DEA, the house would be swarming. But there were no flashing lights, no shattered glass, no bodies on the lawn. It was just dead, terrifyingly silent. Using a bypass key hidden beneath a loose stone, a secret only he and his late wife had known, Gabriel unlocked the secondary staff entrance. The heavy door clicked open with a soft sigh. He stepped into the darkness of the mudroom, the smell of lavender floor cleaner hanging in the air. Water dripped from his overcoat onto the imported Achillean tiles. He listened. The massive house groaned against the wind, but underneath the ambient noise, Gabriel caught it. A voice, faint, trembling, coming from the east wing of the house, from the sunroom. Gabriel's grip on the heavy pistol tightened. He moved. Gabriel became a ghost in his own home. He navigated the sprawling, darkened kitchen, stepping perfectly on the edges of the hardwood floors to avoid the floorboards he knew squeaked. He moved past the grand dining room, where a mahogany table sat untouched, and crept down the long hallway, lined with portraits of a family that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. As he neared the heavy, frosted French doors of the sunroom, the voices became clearer. He expected the gruff, panicked tones of his security detail, or perhaps the aggressive bark of intruders tying up his family. What he heard instead made him freeze entirely. It was Isabella, his fiercely independent 17-year-old, and she was sobbing. Gabriel hadn't heard Bella cry since the day of her mother's funeral. She was usually a wall of sarcasm and defiance, a teenager who rolled her eyes at his strict curfews and glared at his bodyguards. But right now, her voice was small, cracked, and completely shattered. "It hurts, Nora. It hurts so bad," Bella wept. Gabriel's heart slammed against his ribs. He pressed his back against the wall, inching toward the crack between the French doors. The sunroom was dimly lit by a single battery-operated camping lantern sitting on the coffee table. The storm outside lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, throwing chaotic, watery shadows across the room. Through the narrow gap, Gabriel's eyes adjusted to the dim light. On the plush rug in the center of the room sat Nora Hayes, the maid. She was out of her uniform, wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and jeans. Kneeling beside her was Bella. Bella's silk pajama top was slipped off her left shoulder, and Gabriel felt the breath completely leave his lungs. Spanning across Bella's delicate shoulder blade and collarbone was a massive, ugly, purple and yellow contusion, surrounded by angry red lacerations. It looked like she had been struck violently with something heavy, a belt buckle, or the butt of a rifle. Nora was gently dabbing the wound with a gauze pad soaked in antiseptic, her own hands shaking slightly. "I know, sweetie. I know. Squeeze my hand." "Breathe through it," Nora murmured, her voice a mix of fierce maternal protection and barely suppressed terror. Sitting on the sofa just behind them was Chloe. Gabriel's quiet middle child was curled into a tight ball, holding her 8-year-old sister Lily in her lap. Lily had her face buried in Chloe's chest, her small shoulders trembling. Chloe wasn't crying. Instead, she was staring blankly at a thick, black leather, bound ledger resting on the coffee table next to the lantern. Gabriel recognized that ledger. It was Lorenzo's. It contained the off-the-books accounts, the extortion money, the bribes paid out to judges in Cook County. It was the one thing Lorenzo guarded with his life, the ledger that proved he was skimming millions from the Rossi family. "I didn't mean to drop the vase," Lily whimpered suddenly, her voice muffled against Chloe's shirt. "I just wanted to get a glass of water. I didn't know Uncle Lorenzo was having a meeting in the kitchen." "It's not your fault, Bug," Bella choked out, wincing as Nora applied a butterfly bandage to the deepest cut. "He was high. He's always high when Dad leaves town." Gabriel felt the world tilt on its axis. Uncle Lorenzo. His most trusted friend. The man who stood up at his wedding. The man he left in charge of his empire and his blood when he traveled. "He hit her so hard," Chloe whispered, her voice hollow, devoid of the innocence a 14-year-old should possess. "He threw the glass at Lily, and Bella jumped in the way. He told us if we made a sound, he'd throw us in the basement with the men he interrogates." Gabriel's hand, holding the loaded firearm, began to shake. A cold, blinding rage unlike anything he had ever felt in his 20 years in the Mafia flooded his veins. It wasn't the hot, reactive anger of a turf war. It was a terrifying, absolute zero drop in temperature. His trusted underboss had been terrorizing his daughters. "We have to leave before he wakes up," Nora said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. She finished taping the bandage and pulled Bella's shirt gently back over her shoulder. "He's passed out in the study with his guards. The security cameras are on a loop. I paid the IT guy out of my own pocket 2 days ago to teach me how to do it. The alarm is dead." "Where do we go?" Bella asked, wiping her tear-stained face. "Dad's in Miami, and even if he was here," Lorenzo told us Dad knows. "He said Dad gave him permission to discipline us because we're ungrateful." Gabriel physically staggered back a half step, the back of his head hitting the wallpaper. "They thought I knew? They thought I authorized this?" "Your father does not know about this," Nora said firmly, grabbing Bella by the shoulders and forcing the teenager to look her in the eyes. "Gabriel Rossi is a dangerous, terrifying man. I shake every time I hand him his coffee. But I have watched him look at you girls when he thinks no one is watching. He is a broken man, Isabella, but he loves you. He would never, ever let someone lay a hand on you." "Then why isn't he here?" Chloe asked bitterly from the couch. "Why are you the only one protecting us, Nora? You're just a maid. If Lorenzo catches you trying to take us, he'll kill you. He'll put a bullet in your head and throw you in the lake." "Then he'll have to shoot me," Nora said, her voice devoid of hesitation. She stood up, grabbing a heavy canvas duffel bag that Gabriel hadn't noticed sitting by the armchair. "I'm not leaving you here. I've been packing this for 3 weeks. Ever since I saw Lorenzo lock Chloe in the pantry for a day, I've got my sister's cabin up in Door County, Wisconsin. It's off the grid. Lorenzo won't look for us there, and by the time your father gets back, I'll find a way to contact him directly." Gabriel stood paralyzed outside the doors. The narrative of his life was unspooling in real time. He believed he had built a fortress to protect his family from his enemies. Instead, he had built a prison, locking his daughters inside with the real monster, while he played the absent king. And the only person standing between his children and absolute destruction was a 26-year-old civilian who made $15 an hour and was willing to take a bullet for kids that weren't hers. Inside the sunroom, the atmosphere was thick with a frantic, suffocating panic. Nora began moving quickly around the room, gathering up the girls' coats from a pile she had evidently staged earlier. "Put these on," Nora instructed, tossing a heavy winter parka to Chloe and handing a small pink jacket to Lily. "Don't zip them yet, the zippers are too loud." "We're going out through the conservatory doors. My car is parked at the bottom of the service hill." "Nora, wait," Bella said, pointing to the black ledger on the table. "Chloe stole that from his desk while he was drinking in the study. She said it has numbers in it. If we take it, maybe Dad will believe us." Nora stared at the ledger, her face pale. She clearly didn't understand the full depth of the criminal enterprise she was brushing up against, but she knew enough to recognize danger. "Leave it. If we take that, Lorenzo won't just look for us to keep you quiet. He'll hunt us down with an army to get his secrets back. We just need to survive tonight." "He told me I was nothing," Bella whispered, her voice breaking again as she gingerly pushed her arms into her coat. "He said Dad was planning to marry me off to the Valenti family in New York anyway, to settle a debt, that I was just property." Gabriel squeezed his eyes shut. The Valenti family. He had taken a meeting with them 2 months ago, purely for a real estate venture in Manhattan. He had never, in his darkest nightmares, considered trafficking his own flesh and blood for peace. Lorenzo had systematically poisoned his daughters' minds, stripping away whatever fragile trust they still had in their father, making them completely compliant through psychological terror. "It's a lie," Nora insisted, zipping up her own raincoat. "It's all manipulation, Bella. Abusers isolate you, so you think they are the only truth in the world. Lorenzo wants you to think your father doesn't care, so you won't fight back. Now, get your shoes." "He's going to kill us," Lily cried softly, her little hands gripping the hem of Nora's sweater. "Uncle Lorenzo is going to wake up." "He won't, sweetie. I crushed 4 of his sleeping pills into the scotch decanter an hour ago," Nora admitted, a tremor of sheer terror finally breaking through her brave facade. "He's out cold. But his guards might do a perimeter check soon. We have to go. Now." Gabriel knew the guards Lorenzo employed. They weren't Gabriel's loyalists. They were mercenaries. Lorenzo had slowly rotated into the estate's security detail over the past year, claiming the old guard was getting sloppy. Gabriel had signed off on the paperwork without looking twice. He had handed the keys to his kingdom to a traitor. It was time to end this. Gabriel uncocked his weapon with his thumb, not wanting the metallic click to startle them, and holstered the Sig Sauer inside his coat. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to compose the savage fury raging inside him. He needed to be a father right now, not a mob boss. He reached out and pushed both French doors open. They glided silently on their hinges, but the sudden shift in the room's air pressure caused the flame in the lantern to flicker violently. 4 heads snapped toward the doorway. Nora gasped, stumbling backward and instinctively pushing all 3 girls behind her own body, acting as a human shield. Bella let out a stifled shriek, while Chloe froze in absolute terror. Gabriel stepped fully into the dim light of the lantern. Water dripped from his dark hair onto his collar. He looked at the maid, standing defiantly in front of his daughters, her arms spread wide, her chest heaving with panic. She thought he was one of Lorenzo's men. "Nora," Gabriel said. His voice was incredibly soft, devoid of its usual gravelly command. It cracked on the second syllable. "Dad?" Bella whispered, peering out from behind Nora's shoulder. Her eyes were wide, dilated with a mixture of shock and sheer, unadulterated fear. She didn't run to him. She didn't look relieved. She shrank back, pressing herself against the glass windows. That reaction, the flinching away from him, hurt worse than any bullet he had ever taken. Nora stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "Mr. Rossi," she managed to stammer, her eyes darting to his wet suit and then to the doorway behind him, expecting Lorenzo to walk in at any moment. "You're not supposed to be home until Friday." "I came back early," Gabriel said, keeping his hands visible, palms open and empty by his sides. He took a slow step forward, but stopped immediately when Nora pushed the girls further back. "Stay right there," Nora commanded. It was a suicide move. A maid barking an order at Gabriel Rossi in his own house was a death sentence in any other circumstance. But her voice was laced with a desperate courage that demanded respect. "Don't come any closer." "Nora," Gabriel pleaded, his eyes moving past her to look at Bella's bruised shoulder, then down to Lily's tear-streaked face. I heard everything from the hallway." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Only the sound of the rain lashing against the glass filled the space. "Did you?" Bella asked, her voice shaking with teenage defiance, born of pure terror. "Did you hear that your best friend hits us? Did you hear that he locks us up? Because he said you knew. He said you gave the order." Gabriel slowly sank to his knees, right there on the Persian rug. The expensive fabric of his suit soaked up the water dripping from his coat. He dropped down to their eye level, utterly stripping himself of his towering, intimidating presence. "Isabella," Gabriel said, looking directly into his eldest daughter's eyes, letting a single tear slip down his weathered cheek. "If I had known that Lorenzo had even looked at you wrong, I would have burned this entire city to the ground. I swear to you on your mother's soul, I didn't know." Bella stared at him, her lip trembling. Chloe finally looked up from the floor, her guarded eyes searching her father's face for a lie. Gabriel turned his gaze to Nora. The maid was still standing defensively, her knuckles white. "You saved them," he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "I left them in hell, and you tried to walk them through the fire. I owe you my life." Nora slowly lowered her arms, her posture relaxing just a fraction as the adrenaline began to crash. "He's in the study, Mr. Rossi," she said quietly. "Lorenzo. And he has 4 men patrolling the perimeter." Gabriel slowly stood up, the vulnerability vanishing from his face, replaced instantly by the cold, calculated precision of the apex predator of the Chicago syndicate. The father had apologized, now the boss had to go to work. "Take the girls to the basement panic room," Gabriel ordered, his voice returning to its normal, commanding baritone. "The biometric lock is bypassed. Use the keypad. The code is Sarah's birthday." "What are you going to do?" Chloe asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriel reached inside his coat and pulled out the ledger from the table, tucking it under his arm. He then drew his weapon, the dark metal glinting in the lantern light. "I'm going to take out the trash," Gabriel said softly. "And then, I'm going to get my family back." He turned on his heel, stepping out of the sunroom and back into the dark corridors of the house. The storm outside was raging, but it was nothing compared to the violent reckoning that was about to unfold within the walls of the Rossi estate. The Rossi estate, typically a sprawling monument to Gabriel's success, had transformed into a hostile tactical environment. Gabriel moved away from the sunroom, his footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian runners lining the hardwood corridors. The adrenaline that had initially spiked in his veins had cooled into something far more dangerous, a hyper-focused, icy clarity. He was no longer just the grieving widower, or the absent father. He was the apex predator of the Chicago Syndicate, a man who had survived turf wars on Lower Wacker Drive and orchestrated the downfall of rival bosses from the private dining rooms of the Drake Hotel. He knew every blind spot, every creaking floorboard, and every shadow in this 12,000-square-foot mansion. Lorenzo's men were mercenaries, ex-military burnouts hired through a shell security firm in Cicero. They were heavily armed and arrogant, relying on the storm outside and the isolation of the estate to mask their complacency. Gabriel slipped into the formal dining room, the heavy mahogany table stretching out like a dark lake in the center of the room. Through the arched doorway, leading to the grand foyer, he spotted the first target. A guard in a tactical vest was standing by the front doors, casually scrolling through his phone, an AR-15 slung lazily over his shoulder. The glow of the screen illuminated a thick, bearded face. He wasn't one of Gabriel's loyalists. He was a stranger standing in the house where Gabriel's children slept. The rage flared, hot and suffocating, but Gabriel pushed it down. Noise was the enemy. If he fired his weapon now, the rest of the house would wake up, putting his daughters back in the crosshairs. Gabriel unholstered a serrated, fixed-blade combat knife from his ankle sheath. He moved with the terrifying speed of a man 20 years younger. He crossed the foyer in 3 silent strides, stepping deliberately on the grout lines of the marble floor. Before the guard could even process the shift in the shadows, Gabriel clamped a gloved hand over the man's mouth, yanking his head back sharply to expose his throat. The blade went in clean and deep, severing the carotid artery and the vocal cords in one brutal, fluid motion. Gabriel held the man's flailing body tight against his own, feeling the hot rush of blood over his hands, slowly lowering the heavy corpse to the marble floor to prevent a thud. He wiped the blade on the dead man's tactical vest and took a steadying breath. 1 down, 3 left on the interior perimeter. Gabriel checked his wristwatch, a silver Patek Philippe, a gift from his late wife. 11:42 p.m. Lorenzo's sleeping pills, administered by Nora, would be hitting their peak, but mercenaries ran on rigid schedules. They would notice a missed check-in soon. He moved toward the west wing, where his private study was located. The heavy scent of rain and wet earth filtering in through the drafts was suddenly cut by the sharp, pungent smell of stale cigar smoke. 2 more guards were stationed outside the heavy oak double doors of the study. They were whispering, passing a silver flask back and forth. "Boss is out cold in there," one muttered, wiping his mouth. "Told us not to disturb him until morning. Says tomorrow we prep the girls for the transport." "Transport?" the other asked. "I thought we were just holding down the fort while Rossi was in Florida." "Rossi ain't coming back to this house," the first guard chuckled darkly. Lorenzo gave the New York guys the travel itinerary. "Rossi's supposed to take a bullet outside a club in South Beach tomorrow night. We move the brats to the Valenti safe house in Queens, and Lorenzo takes over the Chicago territory. Clean sweep." Gabriel stopped breathing. The shadows seemed to warp around him. A hit in Miami. Lorenzo hadn't just plotted to usurp him. He had sold Gabriel's life to the Valenti family and planned to use his daughters as bargaining chips to secure the alliance. The sheer scale of the betrayal threatened to crack Gabriel's iron discipline. He couldn't use the knife on 2 men simultaneously without one getting a shot off. He needed a distraction. Gabriel pulled a heavy brass antique lighter from his pocket, a piece he kept on a side table. He hurled it down the adjacent hallway, toward the kitchen. It hit the hardwood with a loud metallic crack that echoed through the dead silence of the house. Both guards flinched, dropping the flask and raising their rifles. "What the hell was that?" one hissed. "Check it out," quietly, the other commanded. As the first guard stepped away, moving cautiously toward the kitchen hallway, Gabriel stepped out from behind a marble pillar. He raised his suppressed Sig Sauer P-226. Phut, phut. 2 hollow-point rounds took the remaining guard in the chest and the forehead. The man crumpled instantly. Gabriel pivoted smoothly, tracking the guard who had walked away. The man spun around at the muffled sounds of the gunshots, raising his AR-15, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. Phut. A single round caught him between the eyes. He collapsed backward into a glass display cabinet, the shattering of the antique glass completely masked by a massive crack of thunder outside. Gabriel stood in the dimly lit hallway, the metallic tang of blood now completely overpowering the scent of cigars. He stepped over the bodies, his eyes locked on the oak doors of the study. The exterior perimeter guards were still outside in the storm, oblivious. But the true monster was just on the other side of the wood. Gabriel pushed the heavy oak doors open. They groaned softly, revealing the cavernous mahogany-paneled study that had been his sanctuary for a decade. The room was dominated by a massive fireplace, where the dying embers of a fire cast a menacing orange glow over the leather furniture and the towering bookshelves. Behind Gabriel's own custom-built desk sat Lorenzo. Lorenzo was a burly, handsome man in his late 40s, his tailored suit jacket discarded on the floor, his tie loosened. He was slumped forward over the desk, his head resting on his arms, a half-empty crystal decanter of scotch knocked over, the amber liquid pooling around a pile of shipping manifests. The crushed sleeping pills Nora had slipped into his drink had done their job. He was completely unresponsive. Gabriel approached the desk slowly. He didn't feel the brotherhood that had bound them for 20 years. He didn't see the man who had pulled him from the wreckage of a car bomb in their 20s. He saw only the bruised purple flesh of his 17-year-old daughter's shoulder. Gabriel reached out, his leather-gloved hand grabbing a fistful of Lorenzo's thick, dark hair. With a violent, jarring yank, he pulled Lorenzo's head up and slammed it back against the high leather backing of the chair. Lorenzo gasped, his eyes flying open, glazed and unfocused. He blinked rapidly, groaning as the heavy sedatives fought against the sudden surge of pain. He looked at the man standing over him, struggling to process the visual information. "Gabriel," Lorenzo slurred, a thick string of drool hanging from his lip. "You're in Miami." "Change of plans, Enzo," Gabriel said. His voice was barely a whisper, a terrifyingly calm vibration that promised absolute violence. Lorenzo blinked, the fog of the drug slowly piercing as the sheer terror of the situation registered. He looked down at the suppressed pistol in Gabriel's right hand, and then at the black ledger tucked under Gabriel's left arm, the ledger Chloe had stolen. "Gabe, listen to me," Lorenzo stammered, trying to sit up, but his limbs felt like lead. The sedative was still deeply anchored in his nervous system. "It's not what it looks like. I was securing the assets." "I saw my daughter, Lorenzo," Gabriel interrupted, his voice void of any human warmth. "I saw her shoulder." Lorenzo's face drained of color. The lie died in his throat. He knew Gabriel Rossi better than anyone in the world. He knew that Gabriel was capable of forgiveness in business, of negotiation in war, but when it came to his blood, Gabriel was an executioner. "They were getting out of hand, Gabe," Lorenzo said, his voice trembling as panic finally overrode the drugs. He tried to scramble backward, but the heavy desk chair trapped him. "You spoil them. They don't respect the family. They don't respect the life. I was trying to teach them discipline while you were gone." Gabriel leaned over the desk, planting his hands on the polished wood, bringing his face inches from Lorenzo's. "You hit a child. You locked a 14-year-old in a pantry," Gabriel stating facts with a chilling detachment. "And then, you sold my life to the Valenti family so you could sit in this chair permanently. You were going to traffic my daughters to New York." Lorenzo's breath hitched. "Who told you that? It's a lie." "The Valentis are making a move, yes, but I was trying to broker peace." "Your guards talk too much, Enzo," Gabriel said, standing up straight. "Or rather, they did. They're bleeding out in my hallway right now." Lorenzo looked wildly at the door, realizing he was entirely alone. The empire he thought he had stolen had collapsed in the span of 30 minutes. "Gabe, please." "We're brothers," Lorenzo begged, tears welling in his bloodshot eyes. "I raised those girls with you. I protected you from the feds in 18. I took a bullet for you in the knee. You owe me." Gabriel raised the pistol, pointing the suppressor directly at the center of Lorenzo's forehead. "You're right," Gabriel said softly. "I owe you a quick death for the bullet you took for me. But for what you did to Isabella, I owe you something much worse." Gabriel lowered the gun slightly, aiming at Lorenzo's kneecap. He pulled the trigger. "Foot." Lorenzo's scream tore through the study, a raw, animalistic sound of sheer agony. He convulsed in the chair, clutching his shattered knee as blood rapidly soaked through his expensive trousers. "That's for the pantry," Gabriel said, his expression completely unchanged. He moved the gun up to Lorenzo's right shoulder, the exact spot where Bella was bruised. Phut! Another muffled shot, another agonizing scream. Lorenzo slumped to the floor, sliding off the chair, writhing in his own blood on the Persian rug. He was sobbing now, begging for his life, the powerful underboss reduced to a pathetic, broken shell. Gabriel walked around the desk, standing over the man who had betrayed everything they stood for. He looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The void inside him, the one he thought had swallowed his humanity after his wife died, had instead been filled with a terrifying, absolute devotion to his children. "They were going to hit you tomorrow night, Gabe," Lorenzo gasped, spitting blood onto the rug. "The Valentis, they already have men in Chicago. If I don't check in by 2 a.m., they're coming here. They're going to burn this house down with you and your brats inside." Gabriel's jaw tightened. He checked his watch. 12:05 a.m. He had less than 2 hours. "Thank you for the intel, Enzo," Gabriel said. He raised the weapon one last time, aiming at Lorenzo's heart. "Tell Sarah I said hello," Gabriel whispered, and pulled the trigger. The basement panic room was built to withstand a C4 blast, fortified with reinforced steel and concrete. Inside, the air was stale, smelling faintly of emergency rations and filtered oxygen. Nora sat on the floor, holding Lily tightly in her lap, while Bella and Chloe huddled together on a cot in the corner. The silence down there was maddening. They couldn't hear the storm, and they certainly couldn't hear the gunshots. Every second stretched into an eternity of agonizing suspense. Suddenly, the heavy steel door hissed, the locking mechanisms disengaging. Nora shot up, pushing the girls behind her once again, grabbing a heavy metal flashlight from the emergency supply kit. She raised it like a club, her heart pounding against her ribs. The door swung outward, and Gabriel stepped into the harsh fluorescent light of the bunker. He looked like a nightmare. His dark suit was completely ruined, soaked in rainwater and heavily stained with dark, crimson patches. His hands, still clutching the ledger, were covered in drying blood. But his face was remarkably calm, the storm of violence that had possessed him completely masked. Bella let out a choked sob, seeing the blood on her father. "It's not mine," Gabriel said instantly, holding his hands up to reassure them. He looked at Nora, his eyes conveying a deep, unspoken gratitude, before turning to his daughters. "Lorenzo will never hurt you again. None of his men will." "Is he dead?" Chloe asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a trauma response that broke Gabriel's heart all over again. "He is," Gabriel confirmed softly. He didn't sugarcoat it. These girls had lived in the shadow of the Mafia their entire lives. They understood the currency of their world. "We need to leave," Gabriel continued, his tone shifting into rapid tactical command. He looked at Nora. "You mentioned a cabin. Door County, Wisconsin?" Nora nodded quickly, lowering the flashlight. "My sister's place. It's deep in the woods, near Bailey's Harbor. No Wi-Fi, no landline. Lorenzo didn't know about it." "The Valentis do," Gabriel said grimly. "Lorenzo confessed before he died. The New York families are making a play for the territory. They have a hit squad in the city, and if they don't hear from Lorenzo in an hour, they're coming to this house." Panic instantly reinfected the small room. Lily began to cry again, burying her face in Bella's side. "We can't take my cars," Gabriel said, pacing the small space. "They all have GPS trackers tied to the syndicate's mainframe. Lorenzo's men control the IT room now. If we drive the G-Wagon, they'll track us to the state line." "My car," Nora said, stepping forward. The sheer adrenaline was keeping her focused. "It's a 2012 Honda Civic. It's parked at the bottom of the service hill, completely off the grid. It's got a full tank of gas." Gabriel looked at the 26-year-old Maid. Under normal circumstances, the idea of the head of the Chicago mob fleeing in a rusted 10-year-old compact car would have been laughable. Tonight it was their only salvation. "Can you drive it in this storm?" Gabriel asked. "I grew up driving in Midwest blizzards, Mr. Rossi." "I can handle a rainstorm," Nora replied firmly. "Good. Because I'm going to be busy," Gabriel said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a burner phone he always kept hidden. He dialed a number from memory. "Who are you calling?" Bella asked, her voice shaking. "Paulie," Gabriel replied. "My driver. He's waiting outside the perimeter. I need him to light a match." The phone clicked in his ear. "Boss?" Paulie's voice came through, gruff and alert. "Paulie, the house is compromised. Lorenzo staged a coup with the Valentis. They're coming for the estate tonight," Gabriel said rapidly. "Son of a bitch," Paulie swore loudly. "Give the word, boss. I'll call the boys in. We'll turn this place into a fortress." "No time. And I don't know who is loyal to Lorenzo and who is loyal to me right now," Gabriel said, making the hardest executive decision of his life. He was abandoning his kingdom. I'm taking the girls and dropping off the grid. I need you to buy us time. What do you need? Burn it down, Polly, Gabriel commanded, looking around the sterile walls of the panic room. Rig the gas lines in the main kitchen and the east wing. Throw a flare. I want this entire estate leveled to the ground. If the Valentas show up, I want them to find nothing but ashes and Lorenzo's rotting corpse. There was a heavy pause on the line. You got it, boss. I'll make it look like a war zone. Where will you be? You don't want to know. Lay low, Polly. I'll contact you when the dust settles. Gabriel hung up, snapping the burner phone in half and tossing it into a waste bin. He turned back to the three girls and the maid. They were staring at him in shock. He was destroying their home, erasing their past in a matter of seconds. I'm sorry, Gabriel said to his daughters, the harsh reality of his choices crashing down on him. I built this place to keep you safe, and it became a trap. I'm tearing it down. He walked over to Bella, gently reaching out. This time, she didn't flinch away. She let him wrap his blood-stained arms around her, burying her face in his shoulder. He pulled Chloe and Lily into the embrace, forming a tight, desperate circle in the center of the bunker. I am so sorry I left you, Gabriel whispered fiercely into his children's hair. I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life making this right. Nobody touches you ever again. Nora stood awkwardly by the door, witnessing the profound, broken reconciliation of a family she had been hired to clean up after. She felt like an intruder, but she also felt a strange, fierce pride. She had kept them alive long enough for their father to remember how to be a father. Gabriel broke the embrace and looked at Nora. Lead the way, Nora, Gabriel said, his voice dropping an octave, returning to the tactical commander. Get us to Wisconsin. Nora grabbed her duffel bag and the flashlight. Follow me. Keep your heads down and don't make a sound. They slipped out of the panic room, moving like ghosts through the subterranean tunnels of the estate. Above them, the storm raged on, and the faint smell of gasoline began to waft through the ventilation shafts. The empire of Gabriel Rossi was ending in fire, but as he followed the quiet maid and his three daughters out into the freezing rain toward a rusted Honda Civic, Gabriel realized something profound. He had lost his throne, but he had found his family, and for the first time in 3 years he had something truly worth killing for. The 2012 Honda Civic rattled violently as it hit a pothole on the northbound lanes of Interstate 94. The heater core whined, blowing a weak stream of tepid air against the fogged windshield. Outside, the torrential Chicago rain had transitioned into a vicious, driving sleet as they crossed the border into Wisconsin. Nora kept her hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She was driving exactly 3 miles over the speed limit, fast enough not to arouse suspicion from the highway patrol, but slow enough to maintain control on the slick asphalt. Beside her in the passenger seat, Gabriel Rossi sat rigidly, his broad shoulders practically touching the window. He looked entirely out of place in the cramped, faded interior of the compact car, an emperor stripped of his chariot. In the back seat, the girls were finally asleep. Lily was curled across Bella's lap, while Chloe leaned her head against the cold glass, her breathing slow and rhythmic. The heavy canvas duffel bag Nora had packed sat by Gabriel's feet, a stark reminder of how little they had escaped with. For the first 100 miles, the silence in the car had been absolute, heavy with the phantom echoes of gunfire and the unimaginable trauma left behind in Lake Forest. But as they bypassed the sleeping industrial skyline of Milwaukee, Gabriel finally spoke. You handled the car well back there, Gabriel murmured, his voice a low, gravelly hum that barely competed with the rattling engine, getting off the estate without triggering the motion sensors on the lower gate. You knew the blind spots. Nora didn't take her eyes off the road. I memorized them 2 months ago. When I saw Lorenzo backhand one of the kitchen staff for dropping a tray, I knew he was capable of worse. I started paying attention to the security rotations. I figured out the cameras swept the lower gate every 45 seconds. Gabriel turned his head to look at her. The intermittent orange glow of the highway streetlights washed over her profile. She was exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead with dried rainwater, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. Yet she possessed a quiet, unbreakable resilience that Gabriel found profoundly staggering. You risked everything for them, Gabriel said. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement of a debt he could never repay. You're a civilian. You could have walked out the front door, quit, and never looked back. The syndicate wouldn't have cared about a maid. "They aren't just your assets, Mr. Rossi," Nora replied softly, her grip softening slightly on the wheel. "They're children. I lost my own parents in a car wreck when I was 19. I know what it looks like when a house empties out. Your girls were drowning in that mansion. They were terrified of the men guarding them, terrified of the man running them, and frankly, they were terrified of you." Gabriel flinched. The candor was brutal, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. In his world, people only told him what he demanded. Nora was telling him the truth. "I thought I was shielding them," Gabriel confessed, rubbing a hand over his exhausted face. "When Sarah died, the grief, it was a liability. The rival families, the Bratva, the Valentis, they look for weakness. If they saw me mourning, they would have made a move. So I became the monster they feared, but in doing so, I let the real monsters inside my own house." Nora finally glanced at him. The terrifying mob boss, who had executed his own underboss without a second thought, was gone. In his place was a severely broken man, bleeding metaphorically, stripped of his tailored armor. Suddenly, the static-laced radio interrupted the low hum of the heater. A late-night local news anchor's voice crackled through the speakers. "Breaking news out of Lake Forest tonight. Emergency crews are currently battling a massive multi-alarm blaze at a sprawling 12,000-square-foot private estate. Authorities are reporting a series of gas explosions that leveled the East Wing. Ownership of the property is tied to several shell corporations, but sources indicate it belongs to Gabriel Rossi. No word yet on casualties, but the structural damage is total." Gabriel reached over and snapped the radio off. In the back, Bella stirred. "Is it gone?" she whispered, her voice rough with sleep. Gabriel turned in his seat. "It's gone, Bella. Paulie did his job. The Valentis will find ashes. They'll think we didn't make it out." Bella looked down at her sleeping sisters, then back up at her father. "What happens now? We don't have money. We don't have guards. We don't even have a house." "We have each other," Gabriel said, his tone resolute. "And for the first time in 3 years, I'm not going anywhere. I promise you." Bella held his gaze for a long moment, the defensive walls of her teenage rebellion warring with the desperate need for her father's protection. Slowly, she nodded, pulling her coat tighter around Lily. "Next exit is Sturgeon Bay," Nora announced, breaking the emotional gravity. "We're almost to the peninsula. We'll be at the cabin before dawn." The sun had not yet breached the horizon when they pulled onto the rutted gravel driveway deep in the pine forests of Bailey's Harbor. The air was bitterly cold, smelling sharply of wet earth, cedar, and the distant freezing waters of Lake Michigan. Nora's sister's cabin was a modest, single-story A-frame structure with peeling green paint, nestled in a dense thicket of towering evergreens. It was completely isolated from the main tourist roads, lacking Wi-Fi, cable, or cell service. To Gabriel, accustomed to biometric vaults and marble foyers, it looked like absolute heaven. They ushered the shivering girls inside. The interior was freezing, smelling of dust and old firewood. While Nora fetched blankets from a cedar chest, Gabriel immediately went to work at the cast-iron wood stove in the center of the living room. It had been decades since he had built a fire, not since a camping trip with Sarah before the girls were born, but his hands remembered the rhythm. Within an hour, a fire was roaring, casting a warm golden light over the rustic wooden walls. The girls were huddled together on a faded floral sofa, drinking instant hot chocolate Nora had found in the pantry, their eyes heavy with the adrenaline crash. For the next 2 days, a strange, fragile domesticity settled over the cabin. Gabriel, a man who commanded an army of hitmen, found himself chopping firewood in the freezing dawn and trying unsuccessfully to cook scrambled eggs on an ancient propane stove. Nora, acting as the bridge, gently guided the girls out of their shell. She helped Bella dress the wound on her shoulder, read books to Lily, and sat in quiet companionship with Chloe. Slowly, Gabriel watched the tension leave his daughter's shoulders. He saw Bella laugh at one of his terrible jokes. He saw Lily ask to hold his hand when they walked to the woodpile. The healing was slow, agonizing work, but the ice was thawing. On the third evening, as the sky bruised a deep violet, Gabriel was standing on the back porch, smoking a cigarette he had found in the glove box of the Civic. The silence of the woods was absolute, save for the wind. He was beginning to believe they had actually done it. The fire in Lake Forest had wiped their slate clean. The Chicago syndicate would splinter, the lieutenants would war over the scraps, and Gabriel Rossi would become a ghost story. Then he heard it. the unmistakable crunch of heavy tires rolling slowly over gravel, cutting their engine prematurely to coast. Gabriel's blood turned to ice. He dropped the cigarette, crushing it beneath his heel. He slipped back into the cabin, locking the heavy deadbolt with a soft click. Nora was at the kitchen sink, washing dishes. Gabriel caught her eye and held up a single finger, motioning for absolute silence. The color drained from her face. She immediately put the sponge down and moved toward the living room, where the girls were playing a board game by the fire. "Bella," Gabriel whispered sharply, pulling his suppressed Sig Sauer from the waistband of his jeans. "Take your sisters into the bathroom. Get in the cast-iron tub. Keep your heads down, and do not make a sound." Bella didn't ask questions. The terror from the estate instantly returned to her eyes. She grabbed Lily by the hand, motioning for Chloe, and rushed down the short hallway. Gabriel moved to the front window, peering through the gap in the curtains. Parked at the edge of the tree line, 50 yards away, were two matte black Chevy Tahoes. The vehicles were silent, but their thermal signatures were obvious. 4 men stepped out into the snow. They were dressed in dark tactical gear, carrying suppressed submachine guns. At the lead was a man Gabriel recognized immediately, even in the dimming light. Silas Valenti, the chief enforcer for the New York family. How? Gabriel's mind raced. Lorenzo was dead. The IT guy. Nora had mentioned she paid the estate's IT guy to teach her the camera loop. The technician must have been on Lorenzo's payroll, monitoring Nora's digital footprint, and found the property deed for her sister's cabin in Wisconsin. He had sold the location to the Valentis. "Are they here?" Nora asked, her voice trembling as she crouched beside Gabriel beneath the windowsill. "Valentis," Gabriel confirmed grimly. 4 shooters, heavily armed. "We're trapped. There's no back door, just the porch, and it faces a drop-off," Nora said, panic tightening her throat. Gabriel checked his magazine. He had 8 rounds left, 8 bullets against 4 men with automatic weapons. It was a suicide mission. "Nora, listen to me," Gabriel said, turning to look at her. His eyes were devoid of fear, filled only with a terrifying, absolute resolve. "I need you to go into the bathroom with the girls. If I fall, you take my spare magazine. You hold the door. You do whatever it takes." "Gabriel," she started, using his first name for the first time. "You brought them to the light, Nora. Now let me do what I do best in the dark," Gabriel said. He stood up, kicking the front door open, and stepped out into the freezing Wisconsin night. The sudden bang of the heavy wooden door hitting the cabin wall echoed like a cannon shot through the quiet woods. Silas Valenti and his men froze, their weapons instantly raised toward the porch. Gabriel didn't hesitate. He didn't wait to monologue or negotiate. He knew the tactical disadvantage of standing in a doorway. He dove over the wooden railing just as a hail of suppressed gunfire tore through the space where his chest had been a millisecond before. Wood splinters erupted into the air, raining down like sharp confetti. Gabriel hit the snow-covered ground hard, rolling behind the massive trunk of an ancient oak tree beside the porch. "Rossi!" Silas barked, his voice carrying over the wind. "Lorenzo's dead. Your house is ash. It's over. Give up the girls, and I'll make yours quick." Gabriel's jaw tightened. They still wanted his daughters for the trafficking ring. The thought ignited a primal, violent inferno within him. He leaned out from the right side of the oak, tracking the closest mercenary, advancing. Phut! Gabriel's first shot was perfectly placed, dropping the man instantly with a hollow point round to the throat. The remaining 3 men opened fire, pinning Gabriel behind the tree. Bark exploded around him, stinging his face. He was hopelessly outgunned, and they were advancing, trying to flank his position. "Flank left!" Silas yelled, motioning to one of his men. Gabriel knew he couldn't stay static. He dropped to his stomach, crawling rapidly through the deep snow toward the stacked woodpile he had built that morning. It offered less cover, but a better angle. As the flanking mercenary stepped into the clearing, aiming at the oak tree, Gabriel popped up from behind the woodpile. Foot. 2 rounds to the chest. The man staggered backward and collapsed into a snowbank. 2 left, Silas and 1 other. "He's behind the wood!" Silas screamed, blind firing his MP5 in Gabriel's direction. The heavy caliber rounds decimated the top layer of the logs, showering Gabriel in sharp debris. Gabriel checked his gun, 5 rounds left. He was bleeding from a deep graze on his left bicep, but the adrenaline masked the pain. He heard the crunch of boots moving closer. They were splitting up to encircle him. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang rang out from the side of the cabin. Silas and his man snapped their heads toward the sound. Beside the cabin window, Nora had thrown a heavy cast-iron skillet onto the gravel driveway, exposing herself for a fraction of a second to create a diversion. It was all Gabriel needed. He stood up, locking his sights on the mercenary, aiming his rifle toward the window. Phut! A headshot. The man crumpled. Silas spun around, leveling his weapon at Gabriel. Their eyes locked across the snowy expanse. Silas pulled the trigger, but his gun clicked empty. He cursed, dropping the rifle and reaching for his sidearm. Gabriel didn't shoot. Instead, he holstered his weapon and closed the distance with terrifying speed. Before Silas could unholster his Glock, Gabriel crashed into him, tackling the enforcer into the frozen dirt. Silas was bigger, but Gabriel was fueled by a father's absolute fury. Silas threw a heavy punch, catching Gabriel in the jaw, momentarily stunning him. Silas drew a combat knife, thrusting it downward. Gabriel caught Silas's wrist, the blade stopping inches from his eye. The two men grappled in the snow, a brutal contest of raw strength. Gabriel twisted Silas's arm with a violent jerk, forcing a sickening snap. Silas screamed, dropping the knife. Gabriel grabbed the blade from the snow, flipped it in his hand, and drove it cleanly under Silas's jaw, up into his brainstem. The enforcer went limp instantly. Gabriel pushed the heavy corpse off him, collapsing backward into the snow, his chest heaving, the cold air burning his lungs. The woods were entirely silent once again. The cabin door slowly creaked open. Nora stepped out, her eyes wide as she surveyed the bodies littering the snow. Behind her, Bella, Chloe, and Lily emerged, staring at their father. Gabriel struggled to his feet, clutching his bleeding arm. He looked at his daughters, terrified that the violence had undone all the healing of the past 3 days. He expected them to run back inside, to look at him as the monster once more. Instead, Bella ran off the porch, her boots crunching in the snow. She slammed into him, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist, burying her face against his chest. Chloe and Lily were right behind her, joining the embrace. "You came back," Bella sobbed into his coat. "You fought for us." Gabriel wrapped his good arm around them, pressing his face into their hair, closing his eyes against the stinging cold. He looked up at Nora, standing on the porch, a soft, relieved smile breaking across her face. The Chicago Syndicate was dead. The Rossi crime family was dead. But in the frozen woods of Wisconsin, Gabriel had finally forged the one thing he had always failed to build. The ashes of the Rossi estate smoldered for weeks, taking the legend of Gabriel Rossi with them. The Chicago Syndicate fractured, eating itself from the inside as rival factions warred over a ghost's empty throne. They never found the bodies, and eventually the underworld moved on, forgetting the king who had supposedly burned in his own castle. Far to the north, hidden amidst the dense pines of Wisconsin, a new life took root. Gabriel traded his tailored suits and suppressed weapons for flannel, calloused hands, and the quiet peace of the woods. Nora, who had bravely navigated them out of hell, stayed, becoming the anchor that kept the family tethered to their humanity. Bella, Chloe, and Lily slowly shed the heavy armor of their traumatic past, learning to laugh without looking over their shoulders. Gabriel was no longer a feared boss, he was simply a father, having finally learned that the most powerful empire a man could build was the safety and love of his own home.